Angry misogynist yells at a woman in court, then learns she's his new judge. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy. The kind that comes when people sense an inevitable storm brewing, when something is about to happen that no one will be able to look away from. Brian Keller didn't notice it, because Brian Keller had never been the type of man to notice things that weren't about him. He stood at the defendant's table, his jaw clenched, his face burning red with rage. His voice thundered across the room, overpowering the judge's gavel as he pointed an accusing finger across the courtroom, directly at Eleanor Hayes. "You're out of your damn mind if you think I'm just gonna stand here and let some wannabe hotshot lawyer tell me how to run my business." Eleanor didn't flinch. She remained seated, her expression calm, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She had seen men like Brian before, but arrogant, entitled. She knew his type by heart. He was the kind of man who thought the world was his, simply because no one had ever told him otherwise. Brian turned to the judge, his voice sharp with frustration. "This is a joke. She's a joke. I don't even know why I'm standing here." His lawyer, a nervous-looking man in a gray suit, leaned in. "Brian? No, don't Brian me." He threw up his hands, pacing, shaking his head. "This is exactly why the system is broken. A woman like her comes in here, talking big, acting like she actually—" "Mr. Keller." The judge's voice cut through the room like a blade. Brian stopped mid-sentence. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, sighed as he looked down at him. "I suggest you conduct yourself with more restraint. You are still in a court of law." Brian rolled his eyes. "Right? Because this is so serious?" He shot Eleanor a smirk. "What was it again? A discrimination suit? Because one of my female employees got her feelings hurt?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. Eleanor did not react. She simply tilted her head slightly, watching him. "Waiting. Let's just be real here," Brian continued, gesturing wildly. "This whole thing is a damn waste of time. I built my company from the ground up. I gave those people jobs. I made them money." He sneered. "And what do I get in return? Some lawyer trying to rip it all away." Eleanor finally spoke. "Some lawyer?" Her voice was quiet, smooth, but there was an edge to it, one that froze Brian's smirk in place. She stood slowly, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve before meeting his gaze. "I find it fascinating, Mr. Keller, how men like you always use the same language. You built this. You gave people jobs. As if the success of your company was born out of nothing but your own brilliance." She took a step forward. "But tell me, if you're the reason your company is thriving, then why are we sitting here in court today?" Brian's smirk twitched. "Because one woman made some noise?" Eleanor continued. "Because she had the nerve to say something about the way you treated her? About the way you treat all the women in your company?" Brian scoffed. "Oh, please." He folded his arms, shaking his head. "This is exactly what's wrong with women in the workplace. They don't want to work, they want to complain. They want to play victim." He waved a dismissive hand. "And people like you give them the platform to do it?" Another murmur. This one sharper. The tension in the air shifted. Brian didn't notice. Eleanor did. She smiled. Not a warm smile. A knowing one. "People like me?" she echoed. "And who exactly are people like me?" Brian let out a bitter laugh. "Women who think they can do a man's job." Silence. Not a sound in the room. Just the quiet, suffocating pause that followed. The kind of silence that meant something was coming. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Keller, do you know how many lawsuits have been filed against your company in the last 5 years?" Brian rolled his eyes. "More lawyer talk." Eleanor's smile didn't waver. "I'll tell you." She turned to the judge, lifting a single neatly prepared document from her stack. "This is a compiled list of every single case of gender-based discrimination, harassment, and workplace violations your company has tried to settle quietly." Brian's face stiffened. Eleanor continued. "You see, what's interesting isn't that one woman came forward, Mr. Keller. What's interesting is that dozens of women didn't." She took another step closer. "Because they were paid to stay quiet?" Brian's hands curled into fists. His lawyer swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. Eleanor turned slightly, addressing the courtroom now. The fact that we're here today isn't because one woman filed a case. It's because she refused to take your money, Brian snapped. His voice exploded through the room, his rage boiling over. This is bullshit. The judge's gavel slammed down. Mr. Keller, control yourself. But Brian was past control. He pointed a trembling finger at Eleanor, his breathing ragged. You think you're better than me? You think you're gonna stand there and tell me how to run my own damn business? I don't give a damn about your fancy words or your damn documents. His voice rose, spit flying from his lips. You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing. Eleanor didn't flinch. She just stood there, unshaken, watching him burn himself alive. Finally, after several long seconds, she simply blinked. Are you finished? Brian's nostrils flared. His fists trembled. But he didn't say another word. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temples before nodding toward Eleanor. You may continue. Eleanor nodded and sat back down. She didn't need to say anything else. She had already won. And deep down, Brian knew it. Brian's face was still red with fury, his breathing heavy as the echoes of his outburst hung thick in the air. The judge gave him a long, tired look before turning back to Eleanor. You may proceed, Miss Hayes. Eleanor nodded, smoothing her papers before glancing back at Brian, her expression unreadable. You know, Mr. Keller, she began, her voice level, I have represented many cases in my career. And yet, somehow, men like you always follow the same script. Brian let out a bitter laugh, slumping back in his chair. Oh, here we go. Eleanor didn't react. You deflect, you diminish, you talk about how much you built, how much you gave, and how ungrateful the people beneath you are for wanting the same basic respect that you demand for yourself. Brian scoffed, arms crossed. But what fascinates me, Mr. Keller, is that for a man so confident in his power, she leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the desk. You're panicking. The muscles in Brian's jaw twitched. I'm not panicking. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. No. His fingers drummed against the table. You raised your voice, she continued. You lost your temper. You dismissed legal evidence before even looking at it. She turned to the judge, passing the folder of documents forward. These are copies of every settlement Mr. Keller has paid out in the last 7 years to women who accused him of misconduct. Brian's lawyer cleared his throat, looking visibly uncomfortable. These documents prove, Eleanor continued, that this case isn't just about a single employee speaking up. This is a pattern. A long-standing pattern of discrimination, abuse of power, and intimidation against women in the workplace. Brian's lawyer finally stepped in, straightening his tie. Objection. None of these previous cases are relevant to the matter at hand. Eleanor turned to him, cool and composed. On the contrary, these cases prove intent, a clear pattern of behavior that shows Mr. Keller has actively used his wealth and legal resources to avoid accountability for years. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing at the files in front of him. Objection overruled. Brian's lawyer deflated. Brian sat back in his chair, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. Eleanor leaned back, tilting her head. What's ridiculous, Mr. Keller? Brian let out a humorless laugh. That you think you can destroy me with some old paperwork? Eleanor's expression didn't change. I don't need to destroy you, Mr. Keller. You've already done that yourself. Brian clenched his fists. Eleanor paused. Then she let out a quiet sigh. But I understand, really. You're used to winning, aren't you? She tilted her head slightly. Used to intimidating your way out of consequences. And why wouldn't you be? She gestured around the courtroom. You've been protected your entire life. By your money. By the people who are too afraid to challenge you. She leaned in. But I'm not afraid of you. A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the courtroom. Brian stiffened. And for the first time since he walked into the courtroom, his confidence cracked. The silence stretched. Brian pushed himself to his feet so suddenly that his chair scraped against the floor. You think you're better than me? He hissed. Eleanor didn't move. She just watched him. Like she was waiting. You're just another woman in a suit who thinks she can play in a man's world, Brian snapped. But you're nothing. Just another parasite trying to bring down someone more successful than you'll ever be. A beat of silence. Then Eleanor smiled. Not a kind smile. A knowing smile. "That's interesting, Mr. Keller," she said softly. "Because you said the exact same thing to me the last time we were in court." The courtroom fell silent. Brian's smirk faltered. Eleanor leaned back, watching the realization dawn on his face. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked. Brian's brows furrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" Eleanor folded her hands in front of her. "Several years ago, I represented a woman who had filed a complaint against you. You mocked her, called her a liar. You told her that no one would believe her." Brian froze. His mind raced. He had been in so many lawsuits. Too many to remember. But then, it hit him. His lips parted slightly. But Eleanor watched it sink in. "I was a new attorney then," she continued. "You didn't even bother to remember my name. You dismissed me as nothing more than another annoying woman who would never stand in your way." Her voice was calm. Even. "And yet, here we are." Brian's chest tightened. It wasn't just about this case. This was personal. This woman, this damn woman, had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for years. He tried to keep his voice steady. This is bias. You can't be involved in my case if..." Eleanor tilted her head. "Why not, Mr. Keller? You had no issue speaking over me when I was an attorney. You had no issue calling me incompetent, dismissing me, mocking me." She sat back. "But now..." Her voice lowered. "Now I'm the one holding the gavel." Brian's stomach dropped. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he couldn't hear it. The walls of the courtroom felt too small. He was losing. Losing in a way he had never lost before. "You think this means anything?" he snapped, desperation laced in his tone. "You think you're gonna take me down?" Eleanor studied him carefully. Then she picked up one of the legal documents on the table, flipping through it casually before glancing back at him. "You know, Mr. Keller," she said smoothly, "I had the power to recuse myself from this case." Brian stilled. "She had?" "But then I realized something." Eleanor placed the file back down and laced her fingers together. "You're used to people running away from you. Avoiding conflict. Letting you win." Her voice was softer now. "But I'm not here to run." She met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "I'm here to make sure you finally learn what it means to lose." Brian's body locked. The judge cleared his throat. "We will reconvene after a short recess." The gavel slammed. Brian barely heard it. Because as Eleanor stood, gathering her papers with practiced ease, Brian finally understood. This wasn't a trial. This was a reckoning. And for the first time in his life, he had nowhere left to run. Brian could still hear the echoes of the judge's gavel in his ears, but the sound was distant, muffled beneath the pounding of his pulse. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table, knuckles turning white. He was spiraling. His mind raced through every legal maneuver, every trick, every loophole he had used in the past to escape situations just like this. But there was one undeniable problem this time. Eleanor Hayes wasn't afraid of him. And that changed everything. His lawyer leaned in, voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." Brian didn't move. Didn't blink. The courtroom was emptying for recess, but Eleanor hadn't left yet. She was still at her table, casually flipping through some papers. Completely unbothered. Completely in control. His lawyer grabbed his arm. "Brian, listen to me. This is bad." Brian snapped out of it, his head whipping around. "No kidding." His lawyer's voice dropped lower. "She has everything. Evidence. Settlements. Testimonies. We need to settle." Brian's body went rigid. "Excuse me?" The lawyer exhaled, dragging a hand through his graying hair. "It's the only way to minimize damage. You know as well as I do that the jury is already against you. Hayes is putting on a show, and it's working." Brian bristled. "Settle?" His voice was venomous. "You want me to roll over? Let that..." He clenched his jaw. "Let her win." His lawyer's lips pressed into a tight line. "I want you to stay out of prison." Brian stilled. His lawyer glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot before leaning in. "The second she starts pulling financial records, corporate tax reports and employee testimonies, it won't just be harassment charges. You've laundered money, manipulated stock values, and illegally threatened employees to stay silent. If she keeps digging, she'll find everything. Brian's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. You don't know that. His lawyer gave him a long look. Brian? And that's when the reality set in. Eleanor Hayes wasn't just here to win. She was here to bury him. Brian forced out a breath, dragging a hand down his face. So what? We offer a deal. His lawyer hesitated. It might not be that simple. Brian narrowed his eyes. Why the hell not? His lawyer glanced toward Eleanor, who was now calmly packing up her documents. Because she's not looking for money. She's looking for a lesson. Brian's stomach twisted. He wasn't used to this. He had fought legal battles before, but money had always saved him. Settlements, NDAs, quiet payouts, he had built his empire on silence. But Eleanor wasn't interested in silence. She wanted to watch him fall. And she was going to make damn sure the whole world was watching when it happened. Brian straightened his tie, squaring his shoulders. Fine. I'll talk to her myself. His lawyer's eyes widened. That is, without a doubt, the worst idea you've ever had. Brian ignored him. Because he still had one weapon left. Intimidation. And if Eleanor wasn't afraid of him yet, he would make her afraid. The hallway outside the courtroom was quieter, but tension still hung thick in the air. Eleanor stood by the water cooler, sipping from a small paper cup, flipping through a few notes. Brian approached with slow, deliberate steps, shoving his hands into his pockets. He waited for her to notice him, to glance up, to show even the slightest sign of unease. She didn't. She already knew he was there. You're making a mistake. His voice was low, controlled. Eleanor took another sip of water, then slowly crumpled the cup and tossed it into the nearby trash bin. She finally looked at him. A mistake? Brian stepped closer, lowering his voice. This isn't just about me. You know that, right? You keep pushing this, you'll take down a lot of powerful people. Eleanor's lips twitched in amusement. Is that a threat, Mr. Keller? Brian's jaw tightened. He hated that she wasn't shaking. Wasn't even remotely fazed. It's a fact, he said. You think I built all this alone? You think I don't have people who will step in if I fall? Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him. And then she smiled. Not a kind smile. A dangerous one. Do you hear yourself, Mr. Keller? She said, her tone almost sympathetic. You sound like a child who just realized he isn't the biggest kid on the playground anymore. Brian's stomach twisted. Eleanor stepped forward, just enough to invade his space. But let me tell you something, she murmured. The people you're talking about? The ones you think will protect you? She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a whisper. They're already running. Brian's breath caught. Eleanor didn't blink. You've lost the room, Mr. Keller. You lost it the moment you let your temper show. She straightened, fixing the cuff of her blazer. You're used to power, to control. But the thing about control? She met his gaze. It's only real if other people believe in it. Brian felt something cold settle in his chest. Because for the first time in his life, someone had looked him in the eye and told him the truth. He wasn't powerful. He was just loud. Eleanor turned, starting back toward the courtroom. Then she paused. One last glance over her shoulder. You should start thinking about your final statement, Mr. Keller, she said lightly. Because when this is over, the only words people will remember from you. Her smile was razor sharp. Are the ones you say before you lose everything. And then she was gone. Brian stood there, pulse pounding, hands shaking. Because deep down, he already knew she was right. Brian sat in the courtroom, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The recess was over, and everyone was back in their places. But something was different now. Before, he had felt untouchable. But now he felt like the walls were closing in. Eleanor walked back to her table with the same calm, collected expression she always had. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him. And somehow, that was worse. She wasn't fighting him anymore. She had already won. The judge cleared his throat, flipping through the stack of documents before him. Before we proceed, the court has reviewed the evidence presented by Ms. Hayes and has determined that the records regarding prior settlements and discrimination claims are indeed relevant to this case. Brian's stomach tightened. His lawyer tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. The jury has the right to see the full picture, Mr. Wright. Brian could hear the quiet murmurs from the spectators behind him. He could feel the weight of their eyes. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being admired. He was being watched. Like an animal in a cage. Eleanor finally turned toward him, and for the first time, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She just looked at him, like she was watching a man fall off a cliff. And the worst part? She wasn't going to push him. She was going to let him fall on his own. His lawyer leaned in. Brian, we need to settle. If we wait until the verdict, you'll lose everything. Brian swallowed hard, his throat dry. Settle? Settle meant giving in. Settle meant admitting defeat. His fingers twitched against the table. We can still fight this. His lawyer exhaled sharply. No, we can't. If you keep pushing, they'll go after your financials. Your offshore accounts. If they start pulling those records? Brian's blood ran cold. He had thought this would be another easy win. Another case he could brush off. But now, he wasn't just losing a lawsuit. He was at risk of losing his empire. His lawyer whispered urgently, if we settle, we can at least keep some control. If we let this go to verdict, you could be looking at criminal charges. Do you understand that? Brian clenched his jaw. He understood. But he hated it. Hated knowing that this woman, the one he had dismissed, belittled, underestimated, was the one forcing his hand. For years, his money had been enough to protect him. But money couldn't change the truth. And now, for the first time, the truth was winning. The judge looked at him expectantly. Mr. Keller, do you have anything to say? Brian's lawyer nudged him. This was it. His last chance to control the narrative. He could get up, make a statement, fake remorse. Try to salvage what was left of his reputation. But as he looked out at the courtroom, at the jury, at Eleanor, at the sea of people who were waiting for him to break, he realized something. They weren't waiting for his apology. They were waiting for his collapse. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Brian swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. I would like to settle. The courtroom erupted. A wave of whispers, gasps, murmurs. Eleanor said nothing. She simply watched. The judge banged his gavel, restoring order. Brian sat frozen, feeling the weight of his own words settle over him. He had just admitted defeat. His lawyer squeezed his shoulder, relieved. Smart move, but it didn't feel smart. It felt like the end. The judge nodded. The court will review the terms of settlement. We will reconvene tomorrow for the final hearing. Brian felt his stomach drop. Tomorrow, he would sign the papers that would make everything official. Tomorrow, he would become the thing he feared the most. A failure. The gavel slammed one last time. Adjourned. Brian didn't move. Didn't breathe. His world had just collapsed around him. And all he could do was sit there and watch the dust settle. The courtroom had emptied, but Brian remained seated, staring blankly at the polished wood of the defense table. His lawyer had stepped away to make calls, working out the terms of his settlement. The murmurs of the onlookers had faded, the echoes of the gavel's final strike still ringing in his ears. He had lost. And the worst part? Eleanor hadn't even needed to defeat him. She had just let the truth do it for her. He exhaled, dragging a shaking hand down his face. His body felt numb, as if the weight of his own downfall had physically crushed him. The door opened behind him. He knew who it was before he even turned. Eleanor Hayes. The woman who had unraveled his entire life in the span of a single case. She approached slowly, deliberately. Not gloating. Not smug. Just watching. Brian forced himself to straighten, locking his jaw. Came to watch me fall apart? Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Oh, that was always going to happen on its own. His fingers curled into fists. The rest of the world still thought he was a powerful man. A name that commanded respect, fear, influence. But Eleanor? She saw right through him. And she always had. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. You spent your entire life building walls around yourself, using power as a shield, using money as a weapon. But now, her lips curled slightly. Now you're just a man in a suit. A man who finally has to answer for what he's done. Brian swallowed hard. His voice came out hoarse. Is this what you wanted? Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she shook her head. No, Brian. She sighed. What I wanted was for you to understand. But men like you? She stepped back, smoothing the cuff of her blazer. You never do. And just like that, she walked away. Brian sat there, his pulse pounding in his ears, his world crumbling around him. His settlement would be finalized tomorrow. His company's stock was already plummeting. The media was circling. He was no longer the CEO. No longer the untouchable businessman. No longer the powerful man who could silence anyone who opposed him. Now he was just another scandal. Another cautionary tale. And Eleanor? She had already moved on. The last thing Brian Keller ever learned in a courtroom was that he had never been powerful at all. Brian sat alone in the now empty courtroom, the once powerful CEO reduced to a man staring at the wreckage of his own life. Outside, the world was moving on without him. The murmur of reporters, the clicking of cameras, the excited whispers of those who had waited years to see his downfall, it was all background noise. None of it mattered, because inside he knew. This wasn't just the end of the trial. This was the end of him. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Footsteps echoed across the polished floor. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Eleanor Hayes. She had already won, but now she was back. Not for more arguments. Not for some final strike. She didn't need one, because Brian had already destroyed himself. She stopped a few feet away, standing with the same poised confidence she had carried throughout the entire case. For a long moment, she just looked at him. And then she spoke. You know, she said, her voice quiet, almost thoughtful, there was a time when you could have stopped this? Brian scoffed, shaking his head. Yeah? When the first woman came forward, Eleanor said simply. When she told the truth about you. When she begged someone, anyone, to listen. Brian's lips pressed into a thin line. You could have admitted what you did, Eleanor continued. Faced the consequences. Changed. Brian clenched his fists. Yeah? And what would that have gotten me? Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a victory smile. It was pity. It would have let you keep something. Even if it wasn't everything. Brian's throat tightened. Because he understood exactly what she meant. He had lost everything now. His business. His power. His reputation. His freedom. Eleanor took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the floor. You thought you were untouchable, Brian. That you could silence women, bury lawsuits, pay off victims, and never face the truth. Her expression hardened. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you cover it with money. Brian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Why are you still here? Eleanor studied him for a moment, then tilted her head slightly. Because I want you to understand something. Brian let out a humorless laugh. You think you're my judge now? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I don't need to be. She nodded toward the door. The world already decided your sentence. The jury. The press. The people you hurt. Her voice lowered slightly. Your real punishment, Brian? She leaned in. It's knowing that this time, no one is going to forget. Brian's stomach twisted. Because he knew she was right. There was no coming back from this. For years, he had walked away from scandals, from lawsuits, from every single mess he created. Not this time. This time, his name would be synonymous with disgrace. He wasn't going to be remembered as the brilliant CEO, the powerful businessman, the ruthless leader. He was going to be remembered as a failure, a fraud, a man who thought he was invincible until he wasn't. Eleanor straightened, smoothing the cuff of her blazer. Goodbye, Mr. Keller. She turned and walked away without looking back. Brian sat there, staring at the empty space where she had stood. For the first time in his life, there was no one left to blame. Just him. Alone. And with nothing left. Brian sat motionless in the empty courtroom, the finality of his downfall sinking into his bones like a slow, creeping poison. His empire, his influence, the illusion of control he had once wielded so effortlessly, it was all gone. The silence was suffocating. He had always loved silence before. It had been his ally, his weapon. Silence meant power, that no one dared to speak against him. But now, silence was his prison. He could still hear the echoes of Eleanor's last words in his head. Your real punishment is knowing that this time, no one is going to forget. She had walked out of the courtroom without hesitation, without looking back. And that, more than anything, told him exactly where he stood. Alone, with nowhere left to run. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open again. This time, it wasn't Eleanor. A man in a crisp navy blue suit strode in, carrying a black leather briefcase. Brian recognized him immediately. Daniel Porter, his company's chief financial officer. Or rather, former CFO. Because after today, Brian Keller no longer had a company. Daniel didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked straight up to the defendant's table, setting his briefcase down with a soft thud. He clicked it open and slid a stack of papers in front of Brian. Sign them. Brian stared at the papers. His hands didn't move. What's this? He asked, voice hoarse. Daniel's jaw clenched. The final paperwork. The board has already voted. The company is being dissolved. Brian's stomach twisted. Dissolved? His voice came out sharper than he intended. No, we discussed this. We were supposed to. Daniel's eyes darkened. There is no we anymore, Brian. The words hit like a gut punch. No we. Because no one was standing beside him anymore. His employees had turned on him. His investors had abandoned him. And now, the company, the empire he had built, was being torn apart piece by piece. Brian let out a shaky breath, glaring at the stack of documents. You're just going to let it die? Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temple as if speaking to him was exhausting. No, Brian. You killed it? Brian's throat tightened. Daniel tapped the documents. Sign them. The faster you do, the fewer lawsuits the company will face before it's gone completely. Brian hesitated. And what happens if I don't? Daniel gave a humorless chuckle. Then you get sued personally. And again. Until there's nothing left for them to take but the suit on your back. Brian's hands clenched. He had spent years using money as a shield. Using loopholes and lawyers to keep himself above the consequences of his actions. But now, there were no more shields. Only the cold, unforgiving reality that his money was worthless when no one respected his name anymore. Brian picked up the pen with numb fingers. He didn't want to sign, didn't want to let go. But he had no choice. With each stroke of ink on paper, it felt like he was burying himself deeper. By the time he was done, the finality of it crashed into him like a wave. He had just signed away his life. Daniel took the papers, giving him one last look. I don't feel sorry for you, Brian, he said flatly. Not even a little. Brian didn't respond. What was there to say? Daniel snapped his briefcase shut and turned to leave. Before he reached the door, he paused. One last thing, he said over his shoulder. Brian looked up. Your accounts, offshore, domestic, everything, have been flagged for investigation. Brian's heart stopped. Daniel didn't wait for a response. He walked out, leaving Brian frozen in place. Because suddenly, it wasn't just money and power on the line anymore. It was his freedom. Later that night, Brian sat in his penthouse, staring at the skyline. It had always been his favorite view. Looking out over the city, knowing that he owned more of it than anyone else. That he had built this world. That he was untouchable. But now the city lights felt cold. Like they were watching him. Like they were waiting for the last piece of him to fall apart. His phone buzzed beside him. For a split second, he thought, maybe someone still needed him. Maybe there was one last person left in his corner. Then he saw the caller ID. Unknown number. His stomach twisted. He knew exactly what that meant. The government. The IRS. The walls were closing in. He didn't answer. Didn't move. Because deep down, he already knew how this would end. Jail. Handcuffs. A courtroom where he wouldn't have a single ounce of control left. And Eleanor? She would move on. She wouldn't even think about him after tonight. Because this wasn't her victory anymore. This was just justice. And Brian Keller? He was nothing but a warning to others. The once powerful CEO who thought he could buy his way out of consequences. Who thought no one would ever stop him. Who thought the rules didn't apply to him. And now the world was moving on. Without him, Brian Keller sat in his darkened penthouse, staring out over the city skyline. The once breathtaking view, his domain, his empire, now felt like a mockery. The city kept moving. Lights still flickered. People still lived their lives. But Brian had ceased to exist. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Another investigator, another journalist, another lawsuit waiting to crush what little was left. He ignored it. It didn't matter anymore. For years, he had dodged consequences like a game of chess, always staying 3 moves ahead. Now, he wasn't even in the game. The board had been flipped over. And he was sitting in the wreckage of everything he thought would last forever. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, hollow eyes, a tense jaw, a man grasping at a reality that no longer existed. He had once told himself that power was permanent, that wealth and influence were shields. But standing at the edge of complete and utter ruin, he realized the truth. Power wasn't permanent. It was borrowed. And when it was taken back, you had nothing. Brian exhaled, slow and ragged, running a hand through his hair. His mind kept replaying Eleanor's words. The world already decided your sentence. Your real punishment is knowing that this time, no one is going to forget. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. She had been right about everything. He had spent years silencing others. Now, the world was silencing him. He walked over to his desk, picking up the thick stack of legal documents that Daniel had left earlier. His company was gone. His assets were frozen. His offshore accounts were under investigation. There were warrants pending, subpoenas issued. And soon the inevitable. Federal agents knocking on his door. Prison. Disgrace. A legacy burned to the ground. Brian flipped through the papers with numb fingers, reading his own downfall in black ink. The last binding signature was at the bottom of the final page. The moment he signed it, everything would be official. He would no longer be CEO. He would no longer be Brian Keller, the man who owned everything. He would just be another name in a scandal. A cautionary tale. He picked up the pen. His grip tightened. His breathing was shallow. For the first time in his life, he hesitated. Because after this, there was nothing left. Nothing to fight for. Nothing to rebuild. Nothing at all. He signed his name. Each stroke of the pen felt like a nail in his own coffin. When he finished, he exhaled, staring at his signature like it belonged to someone else. A knock at the door. His pulse spiked. It was time. He walked toward the door, gripping the handle with unsteady fingers. One last breath. One last moment. And then, he opened it. Flashing lights. Badges. Men in suits. Mr. Keller, you're under arrest. And just like that, it was over. The final chapter of Brian Keller's life had been written. And he hadn't been the one holding the pen. Brian Keller sat in the back of the police car, his wrists bound in cold metal cuffs, his mind blank as the flashing city lights streaked past the window. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, he had driven these streets in luxury cars, with tinted windows and security escorts, looking down at people who didn't have his power, his wealth, his status. But now he was one of them. Or worse, he was less than them. Because soon, he wouldn't even be a free man. The officer in the front seat muttered something into his radio, but Brian didn't hear it. His ears were ringing. Not from the sound of sirens. Not from the murmurs of the officers escorting him. But from the deafening silence of his own irrelevance. He had spent decades making sure his name meant something. But his name was just another headline in a scandal. A joke on late-night television. A cautionary tale about a man who thought he was untouchable. And then the world had proven him wrong. The car pulled into an underground parking garage, stopping at a secured entrance. A second set of officers waited there, along with a man in a dark suit. "Mr. Keller," the man said smoothly as Brian was pulled out of the car. "Welcome to your new reality." Brian clenched his jaw but said nothing. Because what was there to say? No threats. No bargaining. No last-minute escapes. The handcuffs dug into his skin as he was led inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air was stale, sterile, suffocating. Doors locked behind him, one after another, until the world he once controlled was no longer accessible to him. This was his life now. The silence wasn't power anymore. It was punishment. They led him through processing, fingerprints, mugshots, personal belongings confiscated, one last hollow reminder of what he once had. Then came the prison uniform, the final piece of his transformation from billionaire to nobody. He stared at the dull gray fabric, his fingers stiff as he changed into it. No designer suits. No tailored perfection. Just the same uniform as every other criminal in this facility. When he was led into the holding cell, a few other inmates looked up, some recognizing him, some not. But no one cared. Brian Keller was nobody here. And for the first time in his life, he had to live with that. He sat down on the cold metal bench, resting his head in his hands. There was no empire to rebuild. No reputation to salvage. No money to fix this. Just time. Endless, merciless time. And the knowledge that when history remembered his name, it wouldn't be for his success. It would be for his fall. And that was a sentence worse than prison. Brian lay on the stiff, unforgiving mattress of his prison bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, old metal, and lost time. He had been here for only a few days, but it already felt like a lifetime. The first night had been the worst. The moment the cell door slammed shut, reality had settled in with a suffocating weight. There were no assistants here. No lawyers. No boardrooms. Just concrete walls and the constant reminder that he wasn't special anymore. He had thought, prayed, that somehow, someway, his money would pull him out of this. But no amount of wealth could erase what had already been written. He wasn't Brian Keller, the powerful CEO. He wasn't the man who intimidated judges, silenced women, controlled the narrative. Here, he was just another inmate. A number in the system. A man no one respected. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. His cheeks were hollow, his stubble growing in uneven patches. He barely recognized himself anymore. The bruises on his ribs still ached from the introduction he had received on his second day. Turns out, prison was full of men just like him. Predators. Liars. Fraudsters. Men who had climbed their way to the top by stepping on others. And when you threw enough of those men in one place, they ate each other alive. Brian had always thought he was the most dominant predator in any room. But in here, there was always someone bigger. He had learned that the hard way. He exhaled, wincing as he shifted his weight. His cellmate, a broad-shouldered man with dead eyes, had warned him after the first beating. "You ain't the boss in here. Nobody gives a damn who you were out there." Brian hadn't responded. Because what was there to say? What could he say? He had spent his entire life believing he was better. That the people beneath him were expendable, replaceable, worthless. And now he was one of them. No money. No power. Just Brian Keller, inmate number 66394. The lock on his cell door buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. He looked up as the guard approached. "You've got a visitor." Brian frowned. A visitor? Who the hell would come see him? His lawyer had abandoned him. His so-called friends had gone silent the moment his empire crumbled. His family? They had disowned him before the trial even ended. The only people who spoke his name now were reporters and prosecutors. Still, he stood, his muscles aching as he followed the guard through the maze of cold hallways. The visit wouldn't change anything. But it was something. And right now, something was better than nothing. The visitation room was sterile and gray, filled with uncomfortable plastic chairs and a thick wall of glass separating inmates from visitors. Brian's pulse skipped when he saw who was sitting on the other side of the glass. Eleanor Hayes. His breath caught. He hadn't seen her since the final day of his trial. Since she had stood in the courtroom and ended his life with nothing but the truth. She sat there now, as poised as ever, her hands folded neatly on the table. Waiting. Brian swallowed, forcing himself to move. He sat down slowly, picking up the scratched black telephone that connected to the other side of the glass. Eleanor did the same. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "But you look different?" Brian let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Prison does that." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Oh, this isn't just prison." Brian clenched his jaw. "Then what is it?" She didn't blink. "Reality." His fingers tightened around the phone. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Eleanor exhaled, leaning back slightly. "I wanted to see what you looked like without the illusion." Brian scoffed. "And? Do you like what you see?" Eleanor didn't smile. "I see a man who's finally feeling the weight of what he's done," she said simply. Brian swallowed hard. There was no malice in her voice. No gloating. That made it worse. Because he could have handled anger. But pity? That was unbearable. "I didn't ask for your pity," he muttered. "I didn't offer it," Eleanor countered. Silence stretched between them. Brian looked down at his calloused hands. The hands that had once signed million-dollar contracts. The hands that had once held the strings of an entire empire. Now they were empty. He inhaled shakily. "You won." Eleanor blinked, surprised by the admission. "You won," he repeated. "You got everything you wanted." Eleanor studied him. "Is that what you think?" Brian scoffed. "Don't tell me you feel sorry for me." "No," she said. "I don't." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp, calculating. "But I also don't see this as a victory." Brian frowned. "Why the hell not?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "Because winning would have meant this never had to happen in the first place." Brian fell silent. He knew what she meant. Winning meant women never had to fight to be heard. Winning meant he never got away with what he did for as long as he did. Winning meant people like him never held power in the first place. Brian let out a breath, pressing a hand to his face. "So why are you here? If this doesn't feel like a win?" Eleanor hesitated for the first time. Then she sighed. "Because I wanted to hear you say it." Brian blinked. "Say what?" Her gaze never wavered. "That you know it was all a lie." The air between them thickened. Brian froze. Because for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what she meant. He had spent years pretending his power made him untouchable. Pretending that money and influence meant he was better. Pretending that the world was his to control. But it had been a lie. All of it. The illusion had shattered. And now he was nothing. Brian opened his mouth. But no words came out. Because there was nothing left to say. Eleanor watched him, waiting. Then, finally, she nodded to herself. And she stood. She placed the phone back on the receiver and smoothed the front of her blazer. Without another word, she walked away. Brian sat there, staring at the empty chair across from him. His fingers hovered over the phone. His pulse was too loud in his ears. And then, for the first time since his arrest, Brian Keller let out a breath and accepted it. This was who he was now. A man without power. A man without a future. A man left with nothing but the truth. The end.